Justice Jackson?
So my biggest concern is that your view has the First Amendment hamstringing the government in significant ways in the most important time periods.
The dumb is so intense here that it actually hurts my brain. Our freedom of speech had a day in court on the Supreme Court. This is the lawsuit brought by the Attorney General of Missouri and a couple of other states against the Biden administration because the administration was working with social media companies, coercing social media companies, pressuring social media companies, and threatening social media companies to censor, delete, silence, and even ban everyday Americans from expressing our opinions on those platforms. Most specifically, where it came to COVID pandemic policies, whether it was lockdown or masks or critically, the vaccine. If you were expressing an opinion that the Biden administration thought was dangerous, then they picked up the phone, they called Facebook, they called Twitter, and they said, delete that, censor it. It would be a shame if something happened to your company, if the federal government started investigating you, if you allow this kind of speech to continue. That's exactly what's already been found as this case has made its way through the courts all the way up to the Supreme Court. And yesterday was the argument specifically about whether the executive branch of the federal government can exert that kind of unilateral pressure. Let's listen to some of the discussion because it's incredibly enlightening. And frankly, this first clip is terrifying. Ketanji Brown Jackson, the woman put on the Supreme Court by Joe Biden, the woman who couldn't even during her confirmation hearings answer the question, what is a woman? She said, I'm not a biologist. She had one of the most frightening questions I've ever heard from a Supreme Court justice when discussing matters of the First Amendment, or for that matter, any part of the Constitution, specifically the Bill of Rights, laid out to restrict the government's infringement on us and our God-given rights. Listen.
Justice Jackson?
So my biggest concern is that your view has the First Amendment hamstringing the government in significant ways in the most important time periods. What would you have the government do? I've heard you say a couple times that the government can post its own speech, but in my hypothetical, kids, this is not safe, don't do it, is not going to get it done. And so I guess some might say that the government actually has a duty to take steps to protect the citizens of this country. And you seem to be suggesting that that duty cannot manifest itself in the government encouraging or even pressuring platforms to take down harmful information. So can you help me? Because I'm really worried about that because you've got the First Amendment operating in an environment of threatening circumstances from the government's perspective, and you're saying that the government can't interact with the source of those problems.
And Your Honor, I understand that instinct. And
Yeah, so the dumb is so intense here that it actually hurts my brain. To say that her biggest concern about all of this is that the First Amendment is hampering and hamstringing the government from regulating what can be said based on what the government believes is harmful or not. That's literally what the First Amendment is all about. It's literally what the Bill of Rights is all about. I mean, literally. Coming out of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the only way the states would ratify the Constitution is if it was ratified in tandem with those 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, that said, okay, this is the structure of our government. This is how it's going to operate. And oh, by the way, these 10 items listed specifically say what the government cannot do to infringe upon your rights that you were born with. Whether it's the right to bear arms in self-defense, or the right to a fair trial, or a speedy trial, or a trial of your jurors, or the right against self-incrimination, and certainly the First Amendment, the right of the freedom of speech that they cannot infringe upon. And her worry is that the government is hamstrung by the First Amendment. Of course the government's hamstrung by the First Amendment. That's the whole damn point. we're going to go back to this little clip and break it down a little further in a bit. But I want you to hear some of the smarter discussions that took place here with Samuel Alito and some of the other justices here. Sit back, listen up.
Exchange between the White House and other federal officials and Facebook in particular, but also some of the other platforms. And I see that the White House and federal officials are repeatedly saying that Facebook and the federal government should be partners. We're on the same team. Officials are demanding answers. I want an answer. I want it right away. When they're unhappy, they curse them out. There are regular meetings. There is constant pestering of Facebook and some of the other platforms, and they want to have regular meetings. And they suggest, they suggest rules that should be applied, and why don't you tell us everything that you're going to do so we can help you and we can look it over. And I thought, wow, I cannot imagine federal officials taking that approach to the print media, our representatives over there. If you did that to them, what do you think the reaction would be? And so I thought, the only reason why this is taking place is because the federal government has got Section 230 and antitrust in its pocket, and it's to mix my metaphors, and it's got these big clubs available to it, and so it's treating Facebook and these other platforms like they're subordinates. Would you do that to the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Associated Press or any other big newspaper or wire service?
Yeah, that's honestly the crux of the whole matter. Right there from the very wise and very smart Samuel Alito. This is, again, and let me just be clear here. This is the White House and the FBI in constant contact with these social media. Imagine if they were in constant contact on a daily basis with ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox News, Town Hall Media, New York Times, Washington Post, coordinating with them, making sure that they were getting the story straight, that no one on their websites or on their networks were publishing or broadcasting anything that was contrary to what the White House and the FBI thought was reasonable and appropriate or harmful. It would never happen. Why? Because of the First Amendment. What made the Biden administration think they could do this? This Section 230 and the potential for antitrust laws. That's what they used, as Justice Alito put it, as a big club. They held it behind their back. Facebook and Instagram, you guys are just too big. We could bring an antitrust lawsuit against you if you don't play ball with us. That's literally what happened here. And if you're watching any cable news or broadcast news network, or if you're seeing any editorial printed on any website where they're celebrating what the Biden administration did here, and they're saying, wow, they acted appropriately, this is absolutely right, just, call them up if you could and just say, okay, are you going to volunteer for this kind of thing? You guys go first. What makes you different? NewYorkTimes.com. or abcnews.com or CNN.com. What makes you different than Facebook.com? Are you ready for everything that you put out there to be policed and judged and gate-kept by whoever happens to be in the White House right now? And by the way, that's the other part of this. The reason that liberals and the left are absolutely open to this idea of this kind of intrusion by the White House, and this was the White House doing this, is because they're guys in the White House, so it'll never affect them. But are they okay if it's a Republican White House picking up the phone and telling them what they can and can't publish? Well, of course not. And neither would I be, by the way. That's the whole point of having principles and values and standards and laws, that they apply either way. But these authoritarians on the left right now, they're perfectly fine with this stuff, as long as it's conservative voices being silenced or those that they don't agree with. A little bit more.
Well, whether or not the government can do this is something I took up with Mr. Fletcher, depends on the application of our First Amendment jurisprudence. And there may be circumstances in which the government could prohibit certain speech on the internet or otherwise. I mean, do you Do you disagree that we would have to apply strict scrutiny and determine whether or not there is a compelling interest and how the government has tailored its regulation?
Certainly, Your Honor. I think at the end of every First Amendment analysis, you'll have the strict scrutiny framework in which, in some national security hypos, for example, the government may well be able to demonstrate a compelling interest, may well be able to demonstrate.
All right. So not every situation in which the government engages in conduct that ultimately has some effect on on speech necessarily becomes a First Amendment violation, correct?
Maybe not necessarily, Your Honor. I guess the top line question I would ask is, has the government set out to abridge the freedom of speech? And in this case, you see that time and time again, because if you control
That's not the test for First Amendment violations.
Your Honor, this flows from the plain text of the First Amendment, right?
No, I understand, but we have a test for a determination of whether or not the First Amendment is actually violated. So in certain situations, the government can actually require that speech be suppressed if there's a compelling interest, right?
It can, Your Honor. And I guess what I would say is that the courts below never got to strict scrutiny because the government never raised this. This has never been litigated. The question in this case is whether at the front end, the government itself has undertaken
Is the coercion, is the state action, right? That's the question in this case.
And I would urge the court to address the state action issue just like you addressed it in Bantam Books. Use that term 4 times in Bantam Books.
And could I just understand, because it seems like
let me just break that down. That was Ketanji Brown Jackson again. And when they're talking about strict scrutiny and some basic limitations on First Amendment that under extraordinary circumstances the government can exercise. This is the kind of thing. This is like when Geraldo Rivera is reporting live from a war zone, and he actually broadcasts live that the troops are right here in this location, right? Putting troops in harm's way and infringing on the military in a war action, or if you're revealing national secrets that actually put people in harm's way and threaten the national security of our country. But even then, that was claimed with the Pentagon Papers, right? That's been claimed a lot of times that, oh, well, this is against national security. You can't release that. It's going to violate national security interests. And even then, courts are very, very hesitant to side with the government on stuff like that. But in this case, the more important aspect is not that the government has worked to try to silence somebody who's about to reveal something that could put our troops in danger. No, this is a complete and total coercion job that paints with a very broad brush over hundreds, if not thousands of people saying certain things on the internet about the vaccine. And by the way, this is the other part that's incredibly important for everyone to remember. Everything they were trying to silence that they told us was disinformation. Like, for instance, the vaccine isn't going to actually give you immunity. That wasn't disinformation. They knew at the time that was true. They just didn't like it being out there. They've now admitted that was the case. But at the time, they claimed it was disinformation because it was contrary to the message they were sending. In other words, your facts are opposed to our propaganda, but since we're the government, our propaganda wins. And that's everything the First Amendment was written to prohibit. The fact that this is even a debate in the Supreme Court is a little scary. A little bit more of the arguments, and then we'll sort of wrap this up with the reality of what we're facing here in terms of the attempts to censor the social media platform that you're watching this on right now.
Fletcher, whether or not that ultimately becomes a First Amendment violation, I mean, I appreciate the coercion point, and that's sort of the government's first point with respect to the merits of this. But I'm interested in your view that the context doesn't, quote, change the First Amendment principles. I mean, I understood our First Amendment jurisprudence to require heightened scrutiny of government restrictions of speech, but not necessarily a total prohibition when you're talking about a compelling interest of the government to ensure, for example, that the public has accurate information in the context of a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. So I'm just interested in the government sort of conceding that if there was coercion, then we automatically have a First Amendment violation.
So I'm not conceding that that would be the case. I could imagine that in times of pandemic, if there were actual restrictions, maybe those would be justified. But our position here, because we think it's the position consistent with the facts, is that there wasn't any coercion to begin with.
Mr. Fletcher.
Well, and of course there was coercion. We'll get to that in a moment, but you hear what the justice is trying to maintain here. Listen, under a once in a lifetime pandemic, by the way, can we have your word for that? Is it once in a lifetime? Was that it? Not another one? Because I don't know. I got a weird sense. Don't you? Spidey sense tingling a little bit. They keep saying once in a lifetime, which tells me there's probably going to be 3 or 4 more in our lifetime. But the basis of the argument is, well, there's a once in a lifetime pandemic and the government needs to make sure that accurate information is getting out there. That's not the point. Nothing is stopping the government from putting accurate information out there. What they're trying to do is silence any other information that they don't like, and use their proxies at the social media companies to censor and delete that information. That's what they're doing. This isn't about them making sure that accurate information is out there. I'll tell you what, if the government acted in a noble and believable and truthful way over the course of the last 50 or 60 years, if they didn't have a track record of lying to the citizens at every turn, then we'd probably believe the accurate information they give us. But what accurate information did they deliver during the once-in-a-lifetime pandemic that ended up being true? That's the crux of the problem. And this guy, the Solicitor General on behalf of the Biden administration, his only remedy here is not to fix the problem of the fact that the American government is no longer believable and trustworthy. No. The solution is we need to have the power to silence everybody else. And that should terrify you. Now, I just said that obviously there was coercion here. And if you look at the emails that were written back and forth as part of this lawsuit in the first place, or from the Twitter files that Elon Musk released to the journalists that covered it, you can see that there's palpable coercion from the federal government, from the White House, from the FBI. But don't take your own eyes' word for it. Don't take those emails and what the government says word for it. No, how about we ask this guy? Because he was on the receiving end of it. And when all was said and done, and the Twitter files were released, and everybody saw how the government was operating and pressuring Twitter, suddenly this guy raises his hand and say, "Oh yeah, they were definitely." There's a question here whether there was coercion. Listen to Mark Zuckerberg.
So misinformation, I think, is has been a really tricky one, because there are things that are kind of obviously false, right? That are maybe factual, but may not be harmful. So it's like, all right, are you going to censor someone for just being wrong? It's, if there's no kind of harm implication of what they're doing, I think there's a bunch of real kind of issues and challenges there. But then I think that there are other places where it is, just take some of the stuff around COVID earlier on in the pandemic, where there were, real health implications, but there hadn't been time to fully vet a bunch of the scientific assumptions. And, unfortunately, I think a lot of the kind of establishment on that, kind of waffled on a bunch of facts and, asked for a bunch of things to be censored that in retrospect ended up being, more debatable or true. And that stuff is really tough, right? And really undermines trust in that. And
yeah, I'll say it does. Now, he's lamenting that it undermines trust in Facebook and Instagram. I would lament that it undermines trust in, our government that we own. It's ours, we the people, we're supposed to at least. But he said right there that there were things during the pandemic that the government demanded that be censored. And he did. He censored it. Why? Because he was coerced to do it. That's his testimony. Why wouldn't you believe that? And I promised you I'd go back to this one clip of Ketanji Brown Jackson, because let's just say split screen on this, because I want to break down portions of it that should really send a chill up your spine, based on her understanding of the First Amendment and the role of the government in our lives.
Justice Jackson?
So my biggest concern is that your view has the First Amendment hamstringing the government in significant ways in the most important time periods?
Now, let me pause there for a quick second. Her biggest concern is the First Amendment is hamstringing the government in important time periods. She's talking about like a pandemic, national emergency, national security. That's a good thing. Every single decision made in our government during times of emergency should always be shot through the prism of, does this violate people's rights? That should be first and foremost in their decision-making process. And something tells me during the pandemic, it wasn't. Because I saw Gavin Newsom and Andrew Cuomo and how they conducted themselves, especially compared to Governor DeSantis in Florida, who did seem to have people's individual rights in question every single time. But let's keep going.
What would you have the government do? I've heard you say a couple times that the government can post its own speech, but in my hypothetical, kids, this is not safe, don't do it, is not going to get it done.
Yeah, so the attorney representing Louisiana, I think it was the Attorney General of Louisiana in this case, making the arguments, said, listen, nothing's stopping the government from putting out their own messages. They just shouldn't be silencing other voices. And here's Ketanji Brown Jackson saying, kids don't do that. It isn't safe, doesn't get the job done. Kids? Her analogy here is it's like a parent or a teacher talking to children. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of our role as the citizens in this government. They work for us. And her view is, yeah, when the government is trying to give out good, positive safety information to the citizenry, it's just like a parent trying to admonish their child. Is the chill up your spine yet? Just wait.
And so I guess some might say that the government actually has a duty to take steps to protect the citizens of this country. And you seem to be suggesting that that duty cannot.
I want to pause there for a second because I hear this a lot. I even hear this from well-meaning but misguided Republicans, that our first and foremost duty is to protect the American people. I heard that. I remember George W. Bush said that during the war on terror, and it makes us feel good, right? Yeah, we're going to be in harm's way. Terrorists are coming to kill us, and it's the job of every single elected official. First and foremost, the number one job is to protect the lives and safety of the American people. And I know that seems like it makes sense and it sounds good, doesn't it? But it's funny. It's really funny. That's not in their oath of office. You notice that? They never actually swear on the oath of office to protect and defend the safety and lives of the American people. No, they swear to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Isn't that remarkable that we just take this as a given? That we expect our government to constantly be protecting us. It's their number one job. It's the number one most important thing. And listen, I get it. If I were president of the United States and I knew that there was some imminent threat from a foreign power or from terrorists and innocent people were going to be slaughtered, that would weigh on me. That would be hard. That's part of the territory when you want to be president of the United States. I would go to bed every night and wake up every morning worrying about lives that I could protect, that I could do things to help. But guess what? The most important responsibility is protecting our rights. The most important responsibility is protecting our form of government, our Constitution. That's why that's the oath of office. Not to protect the safety and lives of the American people. Because guess what? The chairman of China and Kim Jong-un and the mullahs over in Iran, they all go to bed beautifully every night, knowing that they're doing everything they can to protect the lives of the people in their countries. Because in a totalitarian, authoritarian state where you have no rights and your rights don't need to be protected, then the politicians can rest easy saying, oh, sure, they don't have freedom. They don't have liberty. They don't have rights. But at least they're safe and alive. And I'm a good person, because I rule with an iron fist and I keep them protected, because these children, they'd be dead without me. They need me. They need the strong hand to protect them. That is the difference between our form of government and other forms of government. And the fact that this justice doesn't get it, whose sole job it is to protect the Constitution. Again, chill up your spine. But there's one more part of this that I want to break down.
And you seem to be suggesting that that duty cannot manifest itself in the government encouraging or even pressuring platforms to take down harmful information.
Yeah. This is the most important part. You seem to suggest that the role of government to protect its citizens doesn't manifest in them pressuring, even coercing a social media platform to take down harmful information. What's the most important critical word in that entire passage? Harmful. Who decides what's harmful? In Ketanji Brown Jackson's world, in the political left's world, in Joe Biden's world and his administration, and sadly, the deep state and the FBI, in their world, they're the ones who get to decide what's harmful. And in this specific case of the pandemic, it was differing opinions on the validity and effectiveness of the vaccine, the legality of vaccine mandates, the effectiveness of social distancing and masks and shutting down our economy. If you differed with what Joe Biden said was the official truth of the matter, well, then you were expressing harmful information. I would ask Justice Brown Jackson a question. If I were smart enough to be a lawyer arguing a case at the Supreme Court, I would say, well, let me answer your question with a question, Madam Justice. If the government decided through the White House, and again, I just want to reiterate, this is the White House and the FBI who did all this communication. If they were promoting the idea that there are only two sexes and there are no genders at all, just sexes, and the notion that a child can change their sex and call it their gender identity, and that they can identify themselves as another gender. If the government decided that that kind of language and that kind of idea was harmful to the government and to children, if they decided that anything posted on social media that encouraged children or young adults or anyone for that matter to change their gender identity and dress and talk and demand to be called the opposite sex and even desired to use pharmaceuticals or surgical procedures to physically alter themselves to be the opposite sex, if the government decided that was harmful and any communications or videos or postings on social media must be deleted that encourages that kind of behavior, would you see that as problematic? Would you see that as a proper role for the government? Because if the government decides that that's harmful and they decide to pressure social media and pressure TikTok and pressure Instagram to remove everything that might be seen as encouraging young people to change their sexual identity, if the government did that, something tells me Ketanji Brown Jackson would raise her hand and object to it. And that, my friends, is the entire point. What you find harmful may be something different than I find harmful, and might be different than what Joe Biden finds harmful, or Donald Trump finds harmful, or Ketanji Brown Jackson finds harmful. That's the point. We do not want to cede control and power of our ideas and our thoughts and our speech to somebody else to determine what's good or bad for us. Screw you. We get to decide what's good or bad for us. And that's what this whole argument is all about. And the fact that this woman seems to not get it, like I said, chill up the spine. She's not the only one who doesn't get it, by the way. Right after these arguments were made in the Supreme Court, Karine Jean-Pierre was asked a very simple question. Have you stopped communicating, coercing, pressuring social media companies?
Does the administration still have close contact with social media companies? And in specific, are there still communications about removing misinformation?
Look, I'm going to be, I know there's currently SCOTUS, well, I don't even know if it's happening right now, but there's this particular Missouri case. I'm going to be super mindful, super careful, and not to answer a question that is adjacent to what's happening with this particular case. I don't have any conversations to speak to or to lay out to you about conversations with social media. Obviously, the president tries to communicate with Americans and meet them where they are. You see us do that pretty consistently. I just want to be super mindful as there's an ongoing case happening at this time.
This has nothing to do with the ongoing case happening right now. It wouldn't affect that case, by the way. Please, like the White House has ever shied away from expressing their opinion or talking about the facts at hand while something's being discussed at the Supreme Court. That was BS what you just saw right now. It should be a very simple question to answer. Does the White House still maintain contacts at social media companies and still relay back and forth with them about the content on their platforms? It should be really simple to say, no, we don't. And since she didn't, the obvious answer is yes, they do.